Welcome to this week's installment of Constant Procession. For those of you currently reading my book, The Very Fine Light, please, when you finish it, do go to the book's Amazon.com page and rate it. Later in this episode, St. John Bosco, or rather Don Bosco, during the mid-1800s, his mission in life was to fulfill the calling that the Virgin Mary had imparted on him. Nico Steves here. I'm happy to report, for those of you just tuning in for the first time, my book, The Very Fine Light, is a contemporary novel with Christian themes about a village on the verge of bankruptcy, the mayor with a secret, and Randy, a fun-loving co-worker who's always in trouble for telling it like it is. And now, St. John Bosco. Born in Turin, Italy in the year 1815, St. Bosco lived to the age of 72. Now, during his lifetime, he created the Society of Francis de Sales, also known as the Salesians. And today, they are located in over 125 countries, helping millions of the neediest children and their families. They're the second largest order in the Roman Catholic Church today. St. John Bosco was affectionately known as Father, or rather Don Bosco, by the young orphans and poor boys from the streets of the slums of Turin during the mid-1800s. His mission in life was to fulfill the calling that the Virgin Mary had imparted on him. The Virgin Mary came to St. Bosco in a dream when he was just 9 years old. To quote him, "I saw myself near home in a vast yard full of playing children. Some laughed, quite a few uttered blasphemies. On hearing such foul language, I threw myself into their midst, punching and shouting to silence them. A venerable man appeared, nobly attired. His face was so bright I could hardly look into it. He called me by name. 'Not with your blows, but with meekness and love you shall conquer all these friends. Speak to them at once about the ugliness of sin and the greatness of virtue.' How shall I become knowledgeable? I will give you a teacher. Under her guide, you will become wise." At that moment, I saw a woman of majestic aspect, attired with a cloak that shone as bright as the sun. Seeing me confused, she beckoned me and took me by the hand. "Look," she said. The youngsters had all disappeared. In their stead, I saw dogs, cats, and many other animals. "This is your field of work. Become humble, strong, and sturdy." I asked the woman to speak clearly because I did not know what it all meant. She laid her hand on my head and said, "One day you will understand." St. Bosco became a priest, and he remembered this dream all during his life. The Madonna's visit would continue to drive him. His approach in reaching these children was in reaction to a very real slight he experienced while still quite young. Two priests were coming towards young Bosco and a friend, and he offered a sign of respect towards these priests, and the priests offered just a small nod of acknowledgement as they continued to walk. This being the detached reserve taught to the clergy in those times. Quote, "I felt very displeased. Should I become a priest, I will do the opposite. I will approach the boys and talk nicely to them and give them good advice." So as he grew, he learned to do tricks, tell jokes, and sing as a way of entertaining. As his mother, affectionately known as Mama Margaret, remembered, that Don Bosco would have little events in their yard for the neighborhood children. Little did they both know that at the time, this would be the basis for reaching out to the youth of the streets as he began his priesthood in later life. His first experience with the youth of the streets occurred on the Virgin Mary's feast day in 1841. A 16-year-old boy came into the church to get out of the cold. The custodian assumed he was there to be an altar server, but upon learning he was not, began to drive the boy away. Don Bosco immediately protected the youth and spoke kindly, requesting the youth to return following the Mass. In his own words, Don Bosco's conversation with the boy went something like this: Where are you from? Este. What do you do? I'm a bricklayer. Is your dad alive? He is dead. And your mum? She's dead too. Do you know how to read and write? No. Do you know how to sing? The boy wiped his eyes and looked at me in amazement and replied, No. What about whistling? The boy smiled. That's what I wanted. We were already friends. Have you received your first communion? Not yet. And your first confession? Yes, when I was small. Do you go to catechism classes? I daren't. The young boys would tease me. Would you come if I taught catechisms for you alone? Yes, very willingly. Even here? Provided I'm not beaten. Don't worry, you are my friend. I want you to come next Sunday. With pleasure, but not alone. Bring your friends from the street with you. This boy was John Bosco's first ambassador among the young workers of his neighborhood. He reported meeting that nice priest who also knew how to whistle and invited his friends. The next Sunday, 9 boys came. Each week, more and more came on Sunday to visit John Bosco. Now, in the industrial age, Turin's new factory work drew the poor from the country. Child labor and poor wages found some of the children, as young as 12, in prison for petty crimes. He said these boys are not bad, and he would observe that he had to try to take care of the ones on the street before they fell into crime, plus those recently released from jail. But gangs of youth wandered, especially on Sundays they roamed the city. Those boys needed a school and better treatment at job sites and better jobs. And they needed to be boys to unleash their energy by running and jumping over green spaces, not growing sad on the sidewalks. They also needed to meet God, to discover their dignity and assert it. This was what John Bosco was committed to. And with the trust in his lady, John Bosco started Sunday oratories. Over time, these oratories or meetings were on Sundays and brought upwards of 500 boys, and each oratory was amazing. They began with prayers, sometimes confessions and mass, and then they began to play, and they followed a plain, simple lesson at the end of the day. John Bosco also had some of the boys form a choir. Quote, without music, our meetings would have been like soulless body. They sang at the top of their voices along the city hillsides, but they could also delicately sing a simple song of praise to the Madonna. He sensed that the educator must not stay away from boys' gaiety as he himself had experienced when he was young. St. Bosco believed he must share in it, organize it when it failed to develop by itself, and avoid anything that may have prevented it. The boys returned that love, growing ever fonder of him. The people of Turin mostly did not like these groups, but eventually, however, they came to realize how important his mission work was. There's a description by one of the orphans I'd like to quote. It paints a great picture of what daily life was like. This occurred after Mama Margarita came to live with St. Bosco to help him with his life's work. Quote, John Bosco introduced me to Mama Margaret. Mom, here's a boy from Castelnovo. She laughed and looked for a place where I could sleep. There was not a corner free. That night, I had to sleep at the foot of another boy's bed. Next day, I was struck by the surrounding poverty. Our dormitories, on the ground floor, were narrow, paved with flagstones. In the kitchen, there were few tin bowls, each with its spoon. It was years before we saw forks and knives. The dining room was a shed. John Bosco served lunch, helped to keep the dormitory in order, cleaned and patched our clothes, and served us in the humblest chores. At some point in the developing ministry, John Bosco was encouraged to start the Salesians because his work was expanding in helping the poor and working class of the city. His philosophy was his own, and it was simple. Quote, in every young person, a point of goodness is accessible, and it is the primary duty of the educator to discover that sensitive chord of the heart so as to draw out the best in the young person. Next time, the podcast will follow up on John Bosco's help for the young girls as well. Today, 175 years later, the ministry he created in working with the poor children and disenfranchised have continued as part of the mission of the church. Till next week, I'm Nico Steves here. My book, The Very Fine Light, can be found using the title, The Very Fine Light, on Amazon.com.
Please feel free to contact me at nicosteves.com. That's Nikos Steves, Steves.com. If you like this episode, and for more, share them with friends. This is Nico Steves. Thank you. See you next time.